It was a typical Friday evening in New York. The hum of car engines and street chatter signaling the end of a long work week. Judge Jessica Carter, a respected figure in the legal community, was heading home after a demanding day in court. Known for her sharp mind and unwavering sense of justice, she looked forward to spending the weekend with her daughter Emily, who had just returned from college. But her evening took an unexpected turn. As Jessica passed a familiar intersection, her rearview mirror lit up with flashing red and blue lights. Her heart raced, but she quickly ran through a mental checklist. Seatbelt fastened, speed limit observed, full stop at the intersection. She had done everything right. Yet, the tension she felt was all too familiar. Being a black woman, even a judge, didn't exempt her from the biases that plague society. She pulled over, hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the side mirror, she saw a young officer approach with an air of arrogance, his hand resting on his gun holster. His demeanor suggested he wasn't there to enforce the law, but to assert dominance. "Evening, officer," Jessica said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" The officer, Ryan Miller, glanced at her and didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her car, an expensive black sedan, and then back at her, clearly assessing her. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone cold. Jessica handed over her documents, her fingers brushing his. As he examined her license, his eyebrows rose slightly. "Judge Carter?" he asked, his tone softening but still suspicious. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, I'm not sure," Jessica replied, trying to maintain composure. "Could you tell me? You were speeding and didn't make a full stop at the intersection," Officer Miller said with a smirk. His words were baseless. She had been driving perfectly. "I see," Jessica said, keeping her cool. "I must have been distracted." For a moment, Miller seemed thrown by her calmness, but he quickly recovered. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "Is that necessary, officer?" Jessica asked, tension rising in her voice. "Step out now," he repeated, more forcefully. Reluctantly, Jessica complied, stepping out of the car and standing by the hood while Officer Miller began searching her vehicle. He opened compartments, checked under seats, and inspected the trunk, all with no cause or reason. Her mind raced. Was this really about a traffic violation? Or was it about something else? Was it because she was a black woman driving an expensive car? The familiar knot of injustice tightened in her stomach. Minutes passed, and Miller found nothing. He returned to her, expression unreadable, and handed her documents back. "You're free to go," he muttered. Relief washed over Jessica, but it was soon replaced with anger. She had done nothing wrong, yet had been treated like a criminal. "Is that all, officer?" she asked, her voice now edged with indignation. "That's all," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze as he turned to his cruiser. Jessica got back into her car, her hands trembling slightly. The ordeal was over, but the feeling of injustice lingered. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a reminder of the systemic racism she had spent her career fighting against. As she drove away, one thought dominated her mind. This wasn't over. Later that night, after a quiet dinner with Emily, Jessica sat in her living room with a cup of tea in hand, replaying the events of the evening. The discomfort from the traffic stop lingered in her mind, twisting with the weight of something deeper. It wasn't just the officer's actions. It was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, a pattern of bias, of unfair treatment that she had seen in the courtroom too many times, but had never personally experienced in such a stark way. She had spent her career working within the justice system, advocating for fairness and equality. But now, she was confronted with the harsh reality, even with her position, her education, her years of service. She wasn't immune to the prejudices that so many others face daily. As Emily came into the living room, Jessica's thoughts were interrupted. Her daughter's bright face, full of curiosity, was a welcome sight. But when Emily saw the faraway look in her mother's eyes, she knew something wasn't right. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked softly, her concern evident in her voice. Jessica looked up, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just thinking about what happened earlier." "I heard about it," Emily said, her brow furrowing. "That cop, what he did was wrong. You shouldn't have to go through that." "No one should." Jessica nodded, but her mind was racing. Emily's words were right. But this was bigger than just the incident with Officer Miller. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who didn't have a platform to speak out. The ones whose voices were drowned out by the system. "You're right," Jessica said, her voice calm but with an edge of determination. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the many people who go through this, and worse, every day without anyone ever knowing. It's about a system that lets this happen without consequence." Emily sat next to her, her expression serious. "So, what are you going to do?" "Mom." The question hung in the air. Jessica took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She had fought for justice her entire career. But this was different. This wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about something much larger, something systemic that needed to be addressed. "I'm going to speak out," she said firmly. "This can't keep happening. Not to me. Not to anyone." Emily nodded slowly, a proud smile forming on her face. She had always admired her mother's strength. But now, seeing her resolve, she felt something deeper. This wasn't just about standing up to an officer. It was about standing up to the system itself. The weekend passed quietly, but beneath the calm, a storm was brewing inside Jessica. She couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. The incident with Officer Miller wasn't something she could just let go. It wasn't just a personal affront. It was a reminder that the system she had dedicated her life to upholding was flawed. Deeply flawed. And now, it was up to her to challenge it. By the time Monday came, Jessica was already at her kitchen table, notebook in hand. She had made up her mind. This wasn't going to be an easy battle. But she couldn't stay silent. Not when so many people without her resources or influence, couldn't speak out. She began drafting a formal complaint. It would be the start of something bigger, a movement, a demand for change. As she wrote, her thoughts were crystal clear. This wasn't just about holding Officer Miller accountable. It was about holding the entire system accountable. A system that had allowed behavior like his to continue unchecked for far too long. As Emily came downstairs, still groggy from sleep, she noticed her mother's focused expression. Jessica looked up, meeting her daughter's gaze with a look of determination. "Mom," Emily asked, sitting across from her. "What's going on?" "I'm not letting this go," Jessica replied. "I'm going to take action. I'm going to speak out. And I'm going to fight for change. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone who has ever faced this kind of treatment." Emily smiled, her pride swelling in her chest. "I'm with you, Mom. Whatever you need." "Thank you," Jessica said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'll need all the help I can get." The next morning, Jessica stood at her kitchen counter, brewing her morning coffee, but her mind was already racing. The fire that had ignited the night before burned brighter now. And despite her best efforts to rest, the images of Officer Miller's smug face kept replaying in her head. What if she hadn't been a judge? What if she hadn't known the law so well? Would the situation have escalated further? Her mind continued to churn as she poured the coffee into her mug, the steam rising in front of her face. It wasn't just about the traffic stop, it was about the system. The thought that she, as an influential figure, could be treated in such a demeaning way was a stark reminder of the systemic problems she had been fighting against for years. Emily, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, came down the stairs and joined her mother at the table. "Mom, you up early," she said, yawning as she slid into a chair. Jessica looked up at her daughter and smiled softly, though the heaviness of the morning still lingered. "I've been thinking. I'm going to file a formal complaint against Officer Miller." Emily's eyes widened, and she sat up straighter, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "You're really going through with it, aren't you?" "I have to," Jessica replied, her voice firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who go through this every day and don't have the platform to speak out. Someone has to do something." Emily nodded, her admiration for her mother growing even more. "I'm with you, Mom." Later that day, Jessica met with David Johnson, the civil rights attorney who had become a trusted colleague over the years. She had worked with him on several cases, but this one was personal. As soon as she told him what had happened with Officer Miller, David's face grew serious. "That's appalling, Jessica," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "But you're right. This isn't just about what happened to you. It's part of a much larger issue. And if we take this on, we need to be ready for a fight." Jessica nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Filing a formal complaint against a police officer was only the first step. But she had no intention of backing down. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about demanding systemic change. She wasn't the kind of person to sit back and let things slide. And this time, she wouldn't let fear or intimidation stop her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice unwavering. "We have to go public. I won't let this be swept under the rug." David agreed, and together, they began drafting the formal complaint, making sure every detail was recorded accurately, from the officer's initial stop to his unwarranted search of her vehicle. The words on the page weren't just legal language. They were a statement, a demand for change. As they finished, David looked at her with a solemn expression. "Once we file this, things are going to get messy. The police won't take this lightly." Jessica took a deep breath. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but she also knew that this was the right thing to do. The days after Jessica filed her complaint were a whirlwind. News of the incident spread quickly, and soon, she found herself at the center of a broader conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. But this wasn't just about one officer. It was about a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. 1 week later, Jessica received an email from David Johnson, the civil rights attorney handling her case. The hearing before Internal Affairs had been scheduled for the following week. This was the moment she had been preparing for. On the morning of the hearing, Jessica adjusted her suit in front of the mirror, her nerves steady but her mind racing. This wasn't just a typical court hearing. This was personal. Emily, her daughter, was already downstairs, waiting for her. She could sense the unease in her mother's demeanor. "You ready for this?" Emily asked. Jessica smiled softly. "I have to be." The drive to the Internal Affairs office was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. As they arrived, David was waiting, offering a reassuring nod. "We're ready," he said, his calmness grounding her. The hearing room was filled with tension. A panel of officers sat at a long table. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, was there, alongside Officer Miller, who appeared far less confident than when they had first met. After the usual introductions, Detective Harris cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We're here to review the formal complaint filed by Judge Jessica Carter against Officer Ryan Miller for misconduct during a traffic stop on June 17th. We will review the evidence and hear testimony from both sides." The dashcam footage was played, showing Jessica being pulled over and searched without cause. Watching it on screen only solidified the injustice she had felt during the stop. The video didn't lie. The officer's actions were clear. When the video ended, the room was silent. "Judge Carter," Harris said, his voice even, "would you like to make a statement?" Jessica stood, her heart racing, but her voice steady. "What you saw in that video wasn't an isolated incident. This happens every day to countless black men and women, people who don't have the platform to speak out. Officer Miller's actions reflect a larger issue. I wasn't pulled over because I broke the law. I was pulled over because I fit a profile. That's the reality so many of us face." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for justice. I'm asking for accountability." She sat back down, her words hanging in the air. The hearing continued. But for Jessica, this was the turning point. She had spoken her truth. The days after the hearing were a blur. Jessica's statement had been heard, but now came the waiting. The media was still buzzing with coverage of her complaint against Officer Miller. And as expected, the responses were mixed. Supporters hailed her as a voice for justice, while critics accused her of stirring up unnecessary controversy. The backlash, though expected, stung. Yet Jessica refused to be silenced. She continued her regular duties at the courthouse. But the weight of the case seemed to follow her everywhere. Every glance from her colleagues, Every whispered conversation made it clear that things had changed, even within the walls of the justice system. She was no longer just a respected judge. She had become a symbol, a target. Emily, ever supportive, had noticed the shift in her mother. The constant scrutiny, the hostile comments, and the threats started to take their toll. But Jessica was determined not to let it break her. One evening, after another difficult day, she sat with Emily in the living room. "Mom, you're handling this so well," Emily said, her voice full of pride. "But I can see how much this is affecting you." Jessica met her daughter's gaze and smiled softly. "I'm not going to pretend it's easy, but I can't stop now. Not when I know how important this fight is." As Jessica steeled herself for whatever came next, she received an unexpected call. It was Reverend Sarah Hughes, a well-known civil rights leader who had been following her case closely. "Jessica," she said warmly, "I want you to know that we are with you. We're organizing a rally next week, and I'd be honored if you would speak." Jessica hesitated. A rally, thousands of people, all eyes on her. It was a daunting thought, but as she listened to Reverend Hughes speak about the importance of having a voice in the fight against racial injustice, something shifted in Jessica. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. "I'll do it," Jessica said, her voice firm. "I'll speak at the rally." The days leading up to the rally were filled with a sense of anticipation. Jessica knew that this would be a pivotal moment. The rally would not only be a chance to stand up for her own experience, but it would be a call for change, a moment to say that enough was enough. On the day of the rally, Jessica stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment. The air was charged with energy, and she could hear the chants from the crowd gathering outside. Emily stood beside her, squeezing her hand for reassurance. "You've got this, Mom," Emily said. Jessica took a deep breath. This was it. She stepped onto the stage, the sea of faces in front of her. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jessica held up her hand to quiet them. "I'm not here just for myself," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here for every person who has ever been stopped, judged, or mistreated simply because of who they are. This fight isn't just mine, it's for all of us." The crowd roared in support. This isn't just about one police officer. This is about a system that has allowed injustice to thrive. But today, we stand together, and we say, enough is enough. We will not be silent. The cheers were deafening. Jessica felt a surge of emotion wash over her. She had always fought for justice. But now, she wasn't alone. She had become a part of something bigger, a movement that couldn't be ignored. As the rally continued, Emily rushed to her side, her eyes shining with pride. "You were amazing, Mom." Jessica smiled, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. This was just the beginning. In the days that followed the rally, something began to shift. Jessica had known from the beginning that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. But as the media coverage of the rally spread, the public's reaction became undeniable. People were listening. The rally had been a powerful demonstration of unity. And now, more than ever, Jessica's voice resonated with those who had long been silent. But with the surge of support came even louder criticism. The backlash grew stronger, with police unions denouncing her as an enemy of law enforcement. Social media became a battleground, with heated arguments, threats, and harsh accusations directed at Jessica. Some said she was playing the race card, while others claimed she was trying to dismantle the police force entirely. Despite the negativity, Jessica remained resolute. She knew the stakes were high, and that this was part of the cost of standing up for what was right. One evening, after a particularly tough day, filled with phone calls and emails filled with insults, she sat down at her desk, the weight of it all pressing heavily on her. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from David Johnson. He had good news. Internal Affairs had finally reached a decision regarding Officer Miller. They wanted to meet with her in private before the official announcement. The uncertainty of what that meeting might bring was unnerving. But Jessica knew this was part of the process. She didn't want to get her hopes up. but she had to prepare for whatever outcome lay ahead. With Emily by her side, they drove to the Internal Affairs office the next day, where David was waiting for them. "Whatever happens, we're in this together," David reassured Jessica as they entered the building. The tension was palpable, but Jessica held her head high. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about the future of the system itself. They were led into a small conference room, where two high-ranking officers from Internal Affairs were waiting. Detective Harris was present, along with Captain Wright, who had been overseeing the investigation. Jessica felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she took her seat. The room was silent for a moment as the officers shuffled papers and exchanged looks. "We've concluded our investigation into the complaint you filed against Officer Miller." Detective Harris finally spoke. After reviewing the dashcam footage, conducting interviews, and evaluating the evidence, we have determined that Officer Miller's actions were inappropriate and a violation of departmental policy. A wave of relief washed over Jessica, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Harris continued. "However, we have also determined that his actions do not rise to the level of criminal misconduct. Officer Miller will face internal disciplinary measures, including a suspension without pay and mandatory retraining." Jessica's relief quickly turned to frustration. A suspension? After all the public attention, the threats, and the emotional toll. This was the consequence? A few weeks off and some training? It didn't feel like justice. Not for her. And certainly not for all the other people who had suffered the same treatment without the platform to speak out. Jessica spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, how is this a fair resolution? This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the systemic issues within your department that allow officers like Miller to act with impunity." Captain Wright's expression hardened slightly, but she didn't back down. "We believe this is a fair resolution. Judge Carter, Officer Miller will be monitored, and the department is committed to making improvements in our policies." Jessica clenched her fists under the table. This wasn't enough. Not by a long shot, but as she stood up to leave, she knew this wasn't the end. "This fight isn't over," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "I will continue to push for real change." The decision from Internal Affairs left Jessica feeling disillusioned. Officer Miller's suspension and retraining felt like a hollow victory in the face of the larger issues at hand. While she had pushed the system to acknowledge that something had gone wrong, the consequences didn't seem to reflect the gravity of the problem. The fight was far from over. The following days were filled with mixed emotions. Jessica returned to her regular duties, but now the courthouse felt different. Colleagues who had once respected her were now watching her with a certain wariness. Whispers followed her down the halls, and the tension was palpable, despite her quiet resolve. The pressure of being both a judge and a public figure advocating for change weighed heavily on her. At home, the impact was equally undeniable. Emily had been her steadfast support, but even she could see the toll this battle was taking on her mother. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Emily looked at Jessica, concern etched on her face. "Mom," Emily began, her voice soft. "You're doing something incredible, but I can tell it's taking a toll on you. Are you okay?" Jessica looked at her daughter and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetie. This is just the price of standing up for what's right." But deep down, Jessica knew that the fight wasn't just about justice for her. It was about something much bigger. She couldn't back down now, not when the system was so clearly broken. In the days following the Internal Affairs decision, Jessica threw herself into her advocacy work. She began collaborating with civil rights organizations, pushing for reforms in the police department. There were rallies, petitions, and meetings with community leaders. She spoke at forums, wrote op-eds, and used every platform at her disposal to shine a light on the broader issue of racial profiling and police misconduct. But the backlash also intensified. Her phone buzzed constantly, filled with hostile emails, angry phone calls, and even threats. The hate was ugly, and the personal attacks were often cruel. Yet, for every message of hate, there were countless messages of support from people who understood the magnitude of what she was fighting for. One day, as Jessica sifted through another batch of hateful messages, Her phone buzzed with a different kind of news. It was Marcus, a fellow civil rights advocate, calling with urgent news. They're calling a rally at City Hall. Marcus said, "It's happening in a few days. The organizers want you to speak." Jessica took a deep breath. The idea of stepping into the spotlight again, to stand before a crowd of thousands, was daunting, but she knew it was another critical moment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been targeted by the system. "I'll do it," Jessica said, her voice firm. "This is what I've been preparing for." When the day of the rally arrived, Jessica stood backstage, the noise of the crowd rising in waves. Emily stood by her side, offering quiet support as Jessica gathered her thoughts. The rally was a sea of faces, people who had come to stand with her, to demand change. As Jessica stepped onto the stage, the roar of the crowd was deafening. But it wasn't the cheers that gave her strength. It was the sense of solidarity that washed over her. She wasn't alone. She had a whole community behind her. "Today, we stand together," Jessica began, her voice cutting through the noise. "We're not just fighting for justice for one person. We're fighting for a future where no one has to fear the very people who are supposed to protect them. We're fighting for a future where systemic injustice is no longer tolerated." The crowd erupted in applause. But Jessica wasn't finished. "This fight won't be easy, but we will continue until every person, every single person, can walk through this world without fear of being judged for the color of their skin. This is just the beginning." The rally at City Hall marked a significant turning point. Jessica stood at the forefront of a growing movement. But as the spotlight continued to shine on her, the pressure only intensified. Each headline, each interview, added another layer of weight to her already burdened shoulders. The media coverage continued to escalate, and her name had become synonymous with the fight against police brutality and racial injustice. But it wasn't just the media attention that was overwhelming, it was the hostility that came with it. The threats against her family became more frequent. Her phone rang constantly, filled with anonymous calls and emails, some filled with rage, others with veiled threats. Online, people called her an enemy of the state, a traitor, someone who didn't understand the true nature of law enforcement. The hate was vicious, and for a while, Jessica found it hard to shut out the noise. Despite it all, Jessica knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't allow herself to be silenced, not when there were so many others who couldn't speak up. Every message of hate only fueled her determination to push harder, to continue her fight for a more just world. Emily, however, struggled to understand why her mother kept pushing herself so hard. One evening, after another long day of meetings and press conferences, she sat down beside Jessica, her face full of concern. "Mom," Emily said quietly, "I know you're doing something important, but I can see how much it's affecting you. You're exhausted. You don't have to keep fighting this fight alone." Jessica looked at her daughter, the weight of her exhaustion evident in her eyes. She knew Emily was right. This fight had taken a toll on her, physically and emotionally. But at the same time, Jessica couldn't stop. She couldn't let the fear, the anger, or the pressure derail everything she had worked for. She had made a promise to herself, and to everyone who had been unjustly treated, that she would not back down. "I know it's hard, sweetie," Jessica said softly, placing a hand on Emily's. "But this is bigger than just us. It's about creating a world where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, where no one has to experience what I went through that night. I can't let this go, not when we're so close to real change." Emily nodded, though she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. She was proud of her mother, but she also feared for her. The weight of the world seemed to be on Jessica's shoulders, and she wasn't sure how much more her mother could bear. The following weeks brought more challenges, but Jessica remained unshaken. She met with lawmakers, community leaders, and activists to push for policy reforms. She continued to speak at rallies, to write op-eds, to use her platform to raise awareness. Slowly, the momentum behind her movement grew. The conversation around racial injustice was changing. More and more people were joining the fight. But it was during one of these meetings that Jessica's resolve would be tested once more. As she sat in a small conference room with local leaders, discussing potential reforms, she received a call from David. The news was unexpected. Internal Affairs had scheduled a follow-up meeting, and they were ready to offer a final resolution on Officer Miller's case. "Are you prepared for this?" David asked, his voice laced with both caution and hope. This could be a breakthrough, or it could be another disappointment. Jessica paused. The emotional toll of everything she had fought for hung heavy on her. But she knew that whatever the outcome, this wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the future. It was about forcing the system to recognize that change was not just necessary, but inevitable. "I'm ready," Jessica said, her voice steady. "This fight is far from over." Jessica entered the Internal Affairs office with a heavy heart, knowing this could be the defining moment of her fight. The pressure had been building for weeks, but she refused to back down. Despite the media attention and public support, she couldn't shake the feeling that the system would fail her once again. Inside the conference room, Detective Harris and Captain Wright sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. "We've reviewed Officer Miller's case again. Judge Carter," Harris began. "We've determined that his actions were inappropriate and violated department policy. However, his actions don't warrant criminal charges. The disciplinary action will be a 60-day suspension without pay and mandatory retraining." Jessica's heart sank. Another suspension. Another slap on the wrist. She had expected more, something meaningful. "A suspension isn't enough," she said, her voice firm. "This is about systemic issues, not as one officer. His behavior reflects a deeper problem within the department. You need to do more than just suspend him." Captain Wright's face remained neutral, but Jessica's words hung in the air. "We recognize the broader issues," Wright replied, "but this is the decision we've made regarding this specific incident." Jessica clenched her fists. This is about reform. It's about a system that protects its own, regardless of the harm it causes. The room fell silent. Jessica's frustration was palpable. She had spoken not just as a judge, but as a mother, a citizen, and an advocate for change. As they left the meeting, David, her attorney, said, "It's not over. Jessica, we still have a long road ahead." Jessica nodded. The battle was far from won, but she was ready. This was just one step in a fight for real change. In the days following the meeting, Jessica felt a familiar sense of determination settle in her bones. The outcome of Officer Miller's case had been frustrating, but it was not the end of her fight. If anything, it had reignited her resolve. The system was slow to change, but change was coming, whether it wanted it or not. Jessica continued her work, meeting with lawmakers, attending rallies, and advocating for reforms in the police department. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she could see the signs of progress. More people were joining the conversation, more communities were standing up, and more leaders were beginning to listen. One afternoon, while sitting in her office reviewing case files, Jessica's phone buzzed. It was a message from Reverend Sarah Hughes, the civil rights leader who had supported her throughout the battle. "Jessica, I just wanted to thank you for everything. Your courage has inspired so many. You've given a voice to the voiceless." Jessica smiled softly as she read the message. She had come a long way since that fateful night when Officer Miller had pulled her over. It had been a fight she had never expected to have, but one she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, as Jessica sat with Emily, the exhaustion from the past months was still visible on her face. But there was something else, hope. She had fought for justice, and though the battle was ongoing, she had made a real impact. Emily looked at her mother, her pride shining through. "Mom, I don't think I've ever been prouder of you. You've shown me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Jessica pulled her daughter into a hug, her heart full. "We're not done yet, Emily. There's still so much more to do, but we'll do it together." As Jessica looked ahead, she knew that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had been affected by the broken system. It was for a future where no one had to endure the injustice she had faced. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a leader in the fight for a fairer, more just world. The road ahead would be long, but Jessica was ready. She had started a movement, and no matter how hard the journey, she would continue to push for the change she knew was possible. The fire within her burned brighter than ever. She was a force for justice, and no system, no matter how entrenched, could stop her.